technology being designed, managed, operated in a way that's compatible with the kind of society we want to have in the future? And both of you have answered this question in various ways in your speaking and writing, not so much. And you each have kind of specific thoughts about the ways in which it's not getting us where we want to go, and some specific thoughts about how we might redirect things a bit. And so I'm going to start out just with a question to each of you, and there's a number of places we want to take the conversation before we open it up. So with Anil, you've written recently about how tech needs to be reformed. That tech companies are making business and design decisions every day that profoundly affect people's lives. But when the impact is negative, there's very little recourse. And I know you're concerned about whether technology companies are thinking enough about the impact they're going to have, or even asking the right questions or asking the right experts before they make decisions, and investors and others in this ecosystem as well. You've warned about a backlash that could come sort of against tech that would also be bad for innovation, sort of an overreaction. So now what?
So now what? Well, it's interesting. So just sort of brief background on me. I fit the archetype of what I think a lot of people think of as the tech industry. I was lucky enough that my parents got a computer when I was 5 years old, and I learned to code on that. And I was that kid, not getting any sunlight and spending all their time at a keyboard. And that paid off handsomely when I got a job. And I dropped out of college to start what I called a computer business, was mostly plugging in printers, because that was a way you could make a business back in the 90s. And then ended up creating software. And so I've been very fortunate. And I got to go through that path and have a job making software and working with those that do. And then software got renamed to apps, and I get to keep doing it, and that's cool. And what was interesting was what was missing along the way, especially being self-taught and not going through sort of a conventional academic background and post-secondary education. But even those who do go to computer science programs, I didn't learn about, through technology, civics, through ethics, or the sort of social responsibility. And yet I was able to get into a position where I was creating apps that informed and shaped and influenced what others were doing. And the key examples of that to me were about 15 years ago, I helped some friends create some of the first blogging and social media and social networking tools, including the platform that you use for creating global voices. And so we had these amazing examples of what we thought the internet would be. We're going to give voice to people that didn't have it, and they're going to put their words out in the world. And people built global voices, they built Gawker, Huffington Post with the tools, and we were amazed to see it. And then one of the things early on that just sort of tickled my brain, it stuck with me, and I didn't think through all the implications yet. You okay? All right. Everybody all right? Yeah. Was that when we had a box you would type in to write your content. And this is similar to if you write an email, or if any of you have ever written a blog post or whatever. And when we made the box bigger, the stories on the sites got longer. Right? People wanted to fill the box. We see that today with, you take a picture on Instagram and you might frame your photo to be square, to fit their framing, as opposed to the fact that your camera natively takes, rectangular photos. And it was a trivial example, a minor example, but it taught me that the way we create the software and the technology directly shapes how we communicate with one another, what even our values and our aesthetics are about things, right? So you see people remodeling their entire meal at lunchtime if they're going to take a picture with Instagram, to sort of get it in the best light and shape it. And it's an odd and unusual shift, it feels like, to those of us that remember the time before, but to people who have always taken pictures of their meals, it seems pretty normal. And that was something that I didn't really internalize the implications of for a long time, that we would move a button, change the switch, change a link, and it would change culture. And I look at Julia Angwin was speaking on the panel you were just on earlier, and her team at ProPublica did some amazing research into sentencing software in the judicial system. And essentially the short version of it is there is a very commonly used platform used to assign or suggest sentences, although of course we know how suggestions work in software. You just follow them to judges. And that software, having been trained on our current judicial system, not surprisingly, replicates its biases, especially racial biases in suggested sentencing. And that is not the class of problem in software that we consider bugs. It's not the thing we understand to be what we're doing when we're fixing bugs in software. We're used to, oh, well, these things don't add up right. We're not used to thinking about, am I replicating biases in our society that are unjust? And as I learned more about that, and I thought back on my career, I've been lucky to have crossed paths with people who are in other disciplines paying attention to these things. But if I had stayed on the sort of straight and narrow and doubled down on being a really good coder, which at one time I really wanted to be, I would never have learned to fix that class of bugs. And that to me seems like the core mission, what should be the focus for those of us that create technology, because it's interesting, if you say, whatever, Wall Street isn't treating the average American fairly, you can actually be anywhere on the political spectrum and say that, and people will just sort of give you a cheap round of applause for it. And you can say, I don't trust the media, and people will sort of just, yeah, sure, I go along with that. So there are these disciplines, media, politicians, banking, that people think are just inherently not trustworthy. Silicon Valley does not understand they're about to become one of them. They think everybody still sees this halo where all their kids want to be the next Mark Zuckerberg. And it's like, I'm not raising my son to be the next Mark Zuckerberg for a lot of reasons. It's nothing against Mark. It's just I think we can set different goals than that. And it's interesting to me that the people in Silicon Valley still think that's the path of their own.
Well, speaking of Mark Zuckerberg, Rob, you were just pointing out to me in the program,
Right.
there's a quote from Mark Zuckerberg about civic engagement.
Page 46
Right.
in your printed edition.
It's in the app also.
So isn't our problem solved because Facebook is now engaging?
Well, what strikes me about this excerpt from a community letter he wrote earlier in the year, which is just reproduced in the program as an advertisement, is that he says, as we look ahead to building the social infrastructure for a global community, we will work on building new tools that encourage thoughtful civic engagement. And the forthright adoption of the language of civic engagement, I think, is telling in the wake of the election and all kinds of other things that have come to the attention of ordinary people, but seems to me in deep and obvious tension with the for-profit business model of a technology company. If investors want nothing more than engagement on the platform to drive revenue, it's not always the case that responsible civic engagement will always coincide with maximizing engagement on the platform. In fact, I would think they're quite often in tension and there's a trade-off to be made. So once someone like Mark Zuckerberg says, we're in the business of providing the civic platform in which people come together, not as users to connect with their friends and family, but as citizens to debate what it is we should do in a democracy together, he's invoking language that invites us to engage ethically or civically and to scrutinize what it is that Facebook does and to insist, it seems to me, that maximizing shareholder value can't and shouldn't be the only end to which Facebook is devoted. And I mean, what sort of brings me, I guess, to a bigger point, I'm not a technologist. I haven't had any time in Silicon Valley as in anything except living in Silicon Valley, working at Stanford. And as a philosopher, I'm inclined to think of 35,000-foot level. And when I read a quote like this, what it makes me think of is a famous short article written about almost 50 years ago by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, in which he wrote an article with the title, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Maximize Profit." Mm-hmm. That CSR language and social responsibility for people who are in for-profit companies is to do nothing more than maximize shareholder value. And then in the side, as a philanthropist, from the money that you make, then be socially responsible. Friedman, for all of you in the room, you know this, his famous libertarian. It's also well known that the kind of background ethos of Silicon Valley and tech companies more generally is a libertarian one. I suggest that this is a sort of loose orientation to the tech community at large. You can have your social responsibility as a philanthropist, and in the meantime, make sure you respond to your shareholders by maximizing profit. And what that means is there's a deep tension with what Mark Zuckerberg says here, which is to embrace civic responsibility. Unless you can show me that there's always and everywhere complete compatibility between engagement on a platform and doing what's civically responsible. And I'd suggest there's really good evidence to see that that's not the case.
Yeah, this is interesting. I don't want to make this a referendum on Facebook because I think they're just one player in many, but they're a big one. The interesting things in your response to that, the first to me is that you assume that what he's saying he means, which is not.
He probably thinks he does.
He probably thinks he does, but I always look at, these are publicly traded companies that nominally have boards to hold them accountable. And you look at what it looks like when there is a goal that Facebook does care about. So one example is WhatsApp, the messaging app, which is probably the most popular messaging app in the world. And I use it to talk to my family in India. I think everybody who has family overseas uses the app. And Facebook realized having another messaging app that was not theirs be dominant was really a critical strategic risk for them, so they decided they wanted to acquire it. It depends on which of the sort of various reported versions of this you buy, but there was the time period from when Mark decided that he wanted to own WhatsApp to when they closed the deal was about 4 or 5 days. And the final closing costs for the acquisition of WhatsApp was $22 billion. This is with the company that is clearly he probably had to go to the board and get an approval. But what it looks like when Facebook cares about something is the ability to deploy tens of billions of dollars in days, in less than a week. And then I hear they say they care about civic responsibility, they care about equity and who they're hiring and inclusion and diversity. And I say, can I get $1 billion? Just one. 20 is like, 20's chump change. You do that on a week. Like, can I get $1 billion? And say, it's really hard. It's going to take us a long time. We can't focus on. How about $1/10 billion? You spend that on like your catering budget. Let's do that. And it's all kinds of explanations about why it's really challenging and difficult and tricky. And I think they do express their values very clearly, just not with words.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just think there's this thing where we can follow their actions and know their character.
Rob, I think it's great that you brought up this whole kind of the Milton Friedman paradigm versus kind of broader questions, and not just corporate social responsibility, but what's come to be known in the investment world and elsewhere as sustainability, right? Yeah. And I've had conversations with people in the corporate world recently who've said the United States government might not be supporting the Paris Agreement, but we're going to keep doing what we were going to do because otherwise nobody's going to want to work for us, because our corporate reputation is going to be considered irresponsible, et cetera. And so there are kind of long-term actual bottom line reasons. If you're thinking beyond quarterly profits, if you're thinking only about quarterly earnings, then it's dog eat dog, right? But if you're really thinking long-term about your business and you're running an internet platform, you want democracy to be robust. You want the economy to actually be robust, or you're not going to have much of a business. You want the internet to be free and open and interconnected and not censored all over the place.
Maybe.
I mean, there's variations on this, but why did Google pull out of China, right? It was in their it was not in their short-term interest to do that, but it sent a signal to their users globally that they had some principles that, we're not going to do these things in China because we don't want to have to do them elsewhere. And you can say there were lots of perhaps cynical, commercial motivations, but that's the point, right? Mm-hmm. There is some commercial motivation in doing good, and I guess one question is, how do you reinforce that? As over time has been done with other things. GE now markets a line of eco-imagination products. You have companies like Coca-Cola with human rights policies. When 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that was not seen as in the corporate interest. The boards were not interested in that kind of thing. But over time, there were incentives that came from lots of places, from consumers, from investors, and from regulators to some extent. But which also kind of speaks to an issue, Rob, that you've raised in the past in some things you've written about how our kind of regulatory norms and just sort of generally the way in which our accountability mechanisms, our regulatory mechanisms, our laws are not fit for purpose in dealing with these issues either. Which is
Yeah, I mean, it's a routine thing that technological advancement races ahead of where regulations are capable of keeping up and speaking to the moment. And I mean, this is a kind of an old thought, counts as an old thought in the internet age, that ordinary First Amendment protections of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, which we take for granted as operating in any public square, the place where we exercise freedom of speech these days is often a digital platform like Twitter or Facebook, a place where we associate with others we feel like associating with. Facebook, famously, another place to do that. And yet the First Amendment has no purchase in those places, and in fact, it's a private regulatory universe there with no outside civic input to what's going on. And if you imagine that, as Zuckerberg appears to claim, that the Facebook platform is a space for civic engagement, it's not a space for civic engagement in where the First Amendment operates. It's a space for civic engagement where whatever the internal rules and guidelines of Facebook's own engineers, algorithms, the 20-year-olds in some dark basement, going through various posts.
They have very nice offices.
They do? Okay.
Yeah.
In a really nice basement. I feel outraged, not as a user of the platform, but as a citizen who wants to know that I have input and that there's a public body, or at least an advisory body, to ensure that the things that I think are essential to a civic space are being guaranteed. Mark Zuckerberg's say-so is not good enough for me, and shouldn't be good enough for anybody. To put it differently, I don't want ethically evolved CEOs to be the guarantee of ethically good corporate behavior. I want a series of checks and balances and public accountability that's not the product of thinking that CEOs should be virtuous.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't want him to be the benevolent sultan of Facebookistan.
Correct.
You actually want some accountability and justice around and really legitimacy around the decisions being made.
There's a really interesting thing. I think to that point, you definitely want the CEOs who are leading to do the right thing, because if they weren't, there would be accountability, not because of their sort of benevolent intent. And the interesting thing is, once upon a time, to sort of dwell on the Facebook example, Facebook had a community policy around approving policy changes on the platform. And essentially, you could suggest changes to their terms of service, essentially, if you wanted to, and if you got the support of, at various points, 51% or 30% of the users of Facebook, then you could get that considered by the company. And of course, getting 30% of a billion people or 2 billion people to agree on anything would be awful tough. They changed the policy, and now they're like, we actually officially have no say. So it's even simpler than the process of getting 500 million people to say they want to change. And so it's interesting. There was this era where they at least even aspired to having a public feedback mechanism. Now, that era has expired, but we're seeing activism work for the first time. I think there's a couple things. You go back to when North Carolina was sort of enacting its bigoted bathroom law, and what they did really galvanized a lot of people in the tech industry to sort of say, we're not going to build an office there, we're not going to put those jobs there, and put a sort of economic pressure on it. That was interesting to me, because it was actually almost entirely on ethical grounds. It's like, if you're Salesforce.com, building an office in one state versus the other is like a rounding error. There's not a real strong economic case. They really sort of want to plant their flag on that, and I think that is a triumph for the activists who are working on that issue, that they sort of were able to pressure the company there. It's interesting to me, now a company will hold the line there and not on, say, policing reform, right? So like, what are the issues where they feel like this is urgent versus not? It's hard to discern where they make those lines and those calls. But to me, the fact that activists were having any purchase at all is interesting. And I'm not I don't blanket vilify the sort of conventional tech industry. I mean, I run a software company. Like, I can't be that critical of what tech is. But I think that's such a that was a really big milestone, and it sort of went unremarked. And then in the last week alone, we've had the CEO of Uber step down. I'm sure all of you sort of seen this from the news. And the interesting thing about that is Uber's making a lot of money. Their investors are on track to profit pretty well. And that is not a circumstance where you usually see a CEO step down. Now, there are some complexities. It might also be because of Uber having misbegotten paths to getting some of the intellectual property that they've gotten around self-driving cars. But fundamentally, the public narrative, at least, is that this is about responding to the way that they treated their employees, specifically women at the company. And the fact that women at the company speaking out about their treatment can lead to wide-scale management changes, all the way to a founding CEO, is unprecedented. It's a really big milestone for the industry. And it's not a victory, it's just the first time we didn't completely lose. And so that's something that I think is remarkable. We're seeing that around Binary Capital is a venture capital firm, investor, the co-founder of whom was outed as having harassed a number of potential entrepreneurs who were women that he wanted to invest in. And several of them publicly spoke up on the record under their own names, which is, again, incredibly brave. And it had an impact. So he resigned from the firm. One of their other partners who was about to join resigned. Their limited partners are talking about what the impacts are going to be on the firm overall. And so there are these milestone things that have happened that wouldn't have happened 2 years ago, 10 years ago, but they're grassroots organizing that took it. It was activism that caused it. It was typically the voices of women, usually women of color, that are giving voice to this. And that's something that has not happened before. And one of the things I'm trying to understand is, the reason that those women have to go to media and press to be their voice is they're not on the boards. They're not the investors themselves. They don't have that leverage. So these structural barriers are in the way to them being able to anticipate it earlier in the cycle before we have those negative problems arise. And I think that's something that, interestingly, all the other industries we think of as backwards and low tech and whatever are much further down the road. You look at consumer products, you look at media and entertainment, and as many problems as those industries have, they're way further and much more mature in governance being attuned to being responsive and responsible.
Yeah, that makes me think of something much more local to me. I teach at Stanford, one of the seed beds of the Silicon Valley and technological innovation. And maybe some of you in the room know, but if you don't, it's worth knowing that just within the past 5-7 years, computer science and engineering has become the runaway largest major at the university for undergraduates. And more or less, the university is in danger of being transformed into a place like MIT or Caltech rather than a traditional sort of liberal arts institution, which it has always strived to be. And that's partly due to the innovation that the computer science department has had in staging really engaging introductory courses and allowing people, no matter what their background level of coding skills, into the major, so they deserve all the credit for that. But it's also, of course, due to these outside economic forces in the sense in which all you have to do as a freshman at the university is hop on the computer science conveyor belt. You get deposited as a senior into a Silicon Valley startup company. And the students talk about this in the following language, that in their 20s, what you're trying to do is purchase 5 lottery tickets, where you try to join startup companies serially for 2 years. Chances are none of them will succeed. But if one of them does, you're made for life, and you're no worse off at the age of 30, having had 2 years of experience in 5 different companies. In fact, you had a great work environment. It's a badge of honor to have participated in something that flopped in Silicon Valley, and you're gaining skills working with interesting people. So I often think about the ethical or moral reckoning that needs to take place on the campus culture as well, to think about what it means to enter into a university experience with this as your expectation at the end. And just as you were saying, Anil, that there's some modest good news to point to, there are some new student groups that are on campus these days pointing to the need for conversation about the moral dimensions of technology or the ethical responsibility of people who code. And the students are clever. They've got a big thing going called Practice Safe CS. And it's really important that algorithms not be seen as just something that is a kind of neutral thing in the background, that there are values inscribed into algorithms, and you have to do that well. There's a group called Ethics, lowercase ETHI, capital CS, and they're sort of way ahead, it seems to me, of the faculty. And I don't mean the computer science and engineering faculty, I mean faculty across the university, in trying to push the university to think much more long run about the moral dimensions that the students think much more keenly than the faculty happens to at the moment.
And this is something we were talking about briefly before, but Stanford has always, I think, been the example of this. Is until recently, there was essentially no formal ethics curriculum as part of the computer science program there. And you contrast to, if you go to journalism school, business school, medical school, there's maybe you roll your eyes your way through it, and it's a couple credits you got to do. but you have to have at least the plausible deniability of I've entertained the idea of how ethics impacts the field that I'm in. And then once you get out and you work in the industry, there are professional organizations that will, again, at least nominally review your conduct, and so you can be disbarred if you don't cross the bar. You can lose your medical license if you transgress in certain ways, and yet you take, the computer scientists, like the people who wrote the software at Volkswagen to fudge the numbers on their compliance with the emissions ratings, and those people didn't lose their coding license because they can't. There's nothing you can do. There's no transgression you can do that keeps you from participating in the industry. And the argument thus far has been we're still a maturing industry. We're very young. We haven't learned these things yet. And I said, well, at the point when you become the wealthiest and most powerful industry in the history of the world, which is like tomorrow, then we should probably step up on these things. And it's striking because you can come at this as an ethicist and talk about these things, but there is not a lot of, within the industry, within people in computer science, people talk to each other as peers and saying, boy, we got to get our ducks in a row on this. They don't feel an urgency yet.
Well, Rob, you kind of take the broader view on a lot of this as an academic, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about how, kind of in other industries on other issues, you develop professional codes of ethics that really have something of a policing role on people's behavior, but also a positive impact on sort of the checklists of the thing that one needs to do in order not to be socially ostracized in their profession.
Right.
But also movements, right? So student movements of all kinds have driven major change in industries.
Right.
And a lot of people in movements, early environmental movements on campuses several decades ago are now investors and executives and so on, board members. And so how do we move this forward?
Good. So you already mentioned the two things that I'd point to. One is a kind of external pressure from above, where above means some government agency threatens to impose public regulations that are often seen, especially from businesses that don't yet have a dense regulatory structure, as overly intrusive and confining and creating all kinds of bottlenecks. So rather than allow government to impose regulations in a crude way, there becomes a kind of business consortium to self-regulate. And that's one time-honored path in which you get a kind of response to the threat of government regulation. And then, just as you said, Rebecca, another mechanism is to threats from below, to student pressure, activists, movements that force either a company or a sector to take account of what it's been up to. I think about that just as a local example at Stanford. You all in the audience know about the success, partial success, I suppose, of student movements about 20 years ago in getting universities to disinvest from businesses that were engaged in apartheid-era South Africa. And the current chair of the Board of Trustees at Stanford University is this really terrific guy, Jeff Reich, former Microsoft executive, and then ran the Gates Foundation for a while. He was an undergraduate at Stanford, and once heard him tell a story in public, so I feel like I can tell it aloud here too, that he arrived as an undergraduate on Stanford's campus and participated in a whole bunch of sit-ins in the president's office and various forms of student activism to get Stanford to disinvest in its endowment. And now he's the chair of the Board of Trustees, and there's a similar movement among students these days to get them to disinvest from oil companies and various forms of carbon-emitting corporations. And he's going to have to confront in the next couple of years whether or not sit-ins will provide a reason for him to effectively try to do the same thing which he was trying to do as a student and did successfully. And that is a mechanism where you can have some effect. As Anil said, I think it's very early days. We see not much hope, I think, at this point of the threat of overwhelming public regulation in the United States, maybe other places. And then activist movements, at best, are just getting started.
Right, and the threat of regulation in Europe, for example, is kind of overdoing it and kind of requiring Facebook and Google to censor, and kind of pre-monitor a lot of content in case it's terrorism or hate speech, and there are a lot of problems in the way that's going. But
it's fun though, because it does feel like to American companies, like European regulation is too onerous, and hopefully it widens the window to like we can get a happy medium and they're okay with it. But it's almost impossible to overstate, to the point about the sort of libertarian bent of like some of the most prominent voices or most influential voices, how extreme they are. You take, Peter Thiel is on the board of Facebook, and his standpoints, like I have friends all across the political spectrum. I'm always happy to embrace different ideas. He's a radical and a really extraordinary set of beliefs, to the point where he has funded like white nationalist alt-right founders of companies. And I've talked to this with other founders that he's given money to, where they're like, I don't feel comfortable going to portfolio meetings with this founder, because and they're not like, I disagree with him and I'm a snowflake. It's like, this is these are dangerous people. And I think that's something where there isn't accountability around it. There actually isn't any way, because of the structures of how much power a lot of these organizations have. And I think one of the things that we've sort of under-remarked on is that not just the investment structures, but also the ownership structures. So a lot of these companies, you take like Snapchat going public, and its shareholders essentially have no real voting power over the decisions of the board and company leadership about the decisions that they make. It's what they call a dual-class voting structure, but essentially completely undoes the idea of what public markets were supposed to do around accountability for companies, which is, again, it's a radical agenda. Like, you can agree, disagree, maybe that is an option that should be there, but it certainly inarguably undermines what our understanding of what the public market's function is. And that didn't happen with the dialogue with millions of Snapchat users. And they weren't like, what do you think of this? Is this a good idea? Does it make a product better? It's just, cementing control in the hands of a few people who, in the case of, Snapchat's founder has a history of saying things that various people found offensive towards women, that he's got this sort of not a great track record. I'm sure he's grown and matured since then, but if he hasn't, what do we do about it? Well, nothing.
So, but what do we do? I mean, we gotta do something, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of parts to it. I think one of the things is it's almost impossible to become an informed consumer of technology today. And there are a lot of reasons why. I mean, one of the examples I always go to is most of your elected representatives at every level, federal, state, local, will proudly trumpet not just that they aren't experts in technology, but that they don't understand it fundamentally. Most of you have a congressperson who will say, I don't know anything about the internet or apps. I got a nephew who's going to tell me about that. And if they said, I don't know anything about banking, I've never heard of Citibank, I'll just ask somebody, you'd be like, this person is incompetent, right? And yet you have companies that everybody's influential and is important to culture, and they will proudly trumpet their ignorance. One, that should be unacceptable. Illiteracy about the most important forces shaping society is unacceptable. That's simple, that's basic. The fact that things are skewed so far that I have to say that is terrifying. So it's like part one. I think part two is you get into being an informed consumer. If you look at, I'm a geek, so I watch a movie and I go on IMDb and I say, what else did this person direct? Who was in there? You go to the apps that are on your phone, you don't know a single name of the people that made it. You don't know who they are, you don't know what they look like. This hurts us on inclusion and diversity in the industry. People don't know that different kinds of creators are there, that they can see somebody like that making these apps. But it also hurts us on all the things that workers have fought for in other creative industries. So you look at why people fight so hard for the credits on a film or on a movie, on a TV show, on a record album. I'm old enough to remember those. And what they wanted to be in those liner notes was getting credit for their work. And of course, this means organizing, right? And these things, like, there are no unions in the entire tech industry. And that's extraordinary when you consider that Apple and Google and the 14 biggest companies in Silicon Valley illegally colluded against their own employees to depress their wages. It's like, they're like, well, I still like Steve Jobs, even though he took money out of my kid's college fund. It's like, I can't help you at that point. And if you wanted to say, well, I prefer to buy apps, use apps from companies that treat their workers ethically, you don't even have the information to make that decision. And so these are things that, like, we have to start asking those questions, because it worked for whether there was dolphin-safe tuna in that can. It worked for how many miles did that apple, travel to get on all its way to the Whole Foods store. And it's like, we can be informed consumers by asking these simple questions, but we don't think about those things. We don't think about the way we consume digital technology that way, because they've taken this stance of neutrality and used it as a very effective way to say, hey, we just make the apps. It's not our fault how they play out in the world.
I'd want to point to, well, first I'd say I don't disagree with anything that Anil just went through, but I want to point to either something like mistakes are even higher than what he just described, or we should also have a discussion at a higher level of abstraction. It's not just we as consumers who use all these tech products should try to learn more about the people who build them and try to hold them accountable in various ways. I think we need to think structurally about how to create a system of checks and balances or an incentive arrangement so that whether you get a good person or a bad person or a good board or a bad board, it's just much more difficult for any particular company or any particular sector to do a whole bunch of things that threaten nothing less than the integrity of our democratic institutions. So my colleague and friend Nate Persily is here. He wrote an article about 6 months ago called Can American Democracy Survive the Internet? There was just a session, I think, an hour or so ago on the very topic. It's not just...
The conclusion was no, I think?
The conclusion was the jury's still out, or you might be surprised, or something like that, which is terrifying. So the task is not to think as consumers of tech products. The task is to think as citizens of a democratic society and what's necessary for democracy to do. Do Facebook or does the smallest tech startup have any obligation to the integrity of democratic institutions? And if your answer is no, their only obligation is to maximize shareholder value and then see how things go, I think you're basically neglecting your own role as a citizen and favoring that as a consumer. And what we need to do is figure out a way to hold companies accountable for the public and civic effects they have, far beyond our role as consumers of those products.
No, that's right, and I think that's a great way to sort of refine the point, because I think the point is, why I start with the consumer argument is that's where we all start. That's the parts we're fluent in. We're not going to learn how the infrastructure of the internet works. I don't want to burden everybody with having to learn every layer of the dependencies there, but we do engage on a daily basis. I think the average smartphone owner spends 2 to 3 hours a day with their thumb on the glass of their phone. And that's going up. And that's something where we could be mindful about that, because the people in this room are the kind of people, like I said, where your food was sourced. You know how the fabrics used to create your clothing were created. You know a lot about what shapes your world. And it can be everything from the specific consumer ideas to the civic impacts, but having a conversation and a dialogue about it. And you think of what's striking is, again, you take media and entertainment, and their industries have a lot of problems, but you can have a conversation like Oscars So White about representation in media, and everybody in the film industry talks about it. The Oscars make changes, and this institution about this creative industry transforms really in a couple of years what the default posture is about this issue. And that's because there's criticism of media, right? There are movie reviewers, they might not be great, whatever, but they exist, and they're not just talking about was I able to follow the story? They're like, this Transformers movie is incoherent, and here's what's going on. And that's something that, interestingly, you don't really read tech criticism. People will tell you, Apple put out a new phone. And that's kind of it. And they'll be like, and the feature is the camera's better. Guess what? The camera's always better. It's always thinner. The battery life's always longer. Spoilers, that's the next 10 iPhones, right? And so now that that's true, and you know what they're going to tell you, they're going to have some other colors. That's it, right? There's nothing, I promise you, it's not going to be that mind-blowing. It'll be great. You'll like it. Buy it. Knock yourself out. But there isn't a critic talking about sourcing, right? They're not talking about labor conditions for the people building it. They're not talking about what are the impacts on your life if you use this device every day, and what are the impacts in society if we support a company making the choices this company's making. And it's striking because we have a higher standard for movies that really, even popular movies like 5–10% of Americans see. Right. We have a higher standard for things that most of us don't do than for something most of us use all day, every day.
So there's starting to be ratings and rankings on a whole bunch of things. I do a ranking that looks
Can you pitch us a little bit on what you're working on?
But not just what I'm doing, but also, there's something called Know the Chain run by Humanity United that's looking at, do companies track and make concerted efforts to keep slave labor out of their supply chain? There's something called the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark that's also, kind of looking at a range of things. And so the stuff I'm doing kind of fits in with that, where we're looking at companies' policies and disclosures in relation to what they're doing that affects your privacy and security, and what they're doing that affects what information you can access and what you can say online through what platforms. And you know, is there any corporate oversight at the board level on freedom of expression and privacy issues? And you know, everybody's pretty much failing or close to it. You know, do we need to have more of that? You know, we're working with Consumer Reports and other organizations to kind of raise the awareness. Will that get us there? Or what are some of the other things we need to do? I want to open this up now, though, because I know that there are a lot of experts in the room and people who have stuff to say. You had your hand up first. I think you had your hand up second fastest, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you. Nobody mentioned education, and I'm interested in why media literacy doesn't start when you learn your ABCs. Just quick, I was invited down to Facebook before Oculus was put out in the market. It was fascinating. I'm a shrink. My husband is a surgeon. And I said, this is fabulous in education and in medicine. And what are you going to release it as? And they said a first-person shooter game. And I said, could I talk to your ethics committee? And we were it was like talking two different languages. I couldn't understand that he didn't understand that there was no ethics committee. So I'm at Stanford Graduate School of Education too, in training people at the graduate level, but also starting from day one. Social media has rewritten adolescence from my point of view. I'm an adolescent psychologist, with some good things and some absolutely horrifying things, and yet people haven't had the kind of education that we're asking parents to do, who don't know how to do it, or we're asking shrinks to do, or teachers to do. It should be part of public education as far as I'm concerned.
Educators don't know how to teach this stuff either, right? Isn't that part of the problem?
Right. I mean, yes, or perhaps but, if you spend time at the Graduate School of Education and you look at the history of American education, you'll know that any time that there's a looming social ill, everyone looks to the K-12 education system to provide a literacy solution to the social ill on the horizon. And so you get financial literacy and media literacy and and pretty soon the schoolhouse and the poor, beleaguered, underpaid teacher is the savior for every ill of a democratic society. My concern is to say, yes, of course we should do media literacy and do it in a smart way, but not that only places the responsibility on the back of the public schoolhouse and the teacher. It's got to be something that's more structural or systematic. And if we think that public schools are the all-purpose solution to every social ill, then just look at some history in order to rid yourself of that delusion.
Gentleman in the green.
The Seventh Sense covered, I think, maybe at least the question that I'm hearing here, which is nobody is really going to use a legitimate threat to change any of this behavior. The ultimate threat is the threat of not being a customer, or in fact, actually not being a customer. And nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to depart from Facebook. Nobody's going to depart from Google. A number of years ago, Eric Schmidt was asked the question here at Aspen about privacy and what they're reading and things like this. And he said, look, we're going to do what we want to do, and if you don't like it, don't use Google. That's it. So I don't know why, other than making nice public statements in pamphlets, why anything else will change.
So I want to hit a couple points. I've been thinking about this a lot. So there are no lunch counters to boycott. And the cost to coming off of social networks is higher to vulnerable people than it is to the networks themselves. Right? If you're on the margins and you say, I'm going to opt out of LinkedIn on an ethical basis, that's going to hurt you a lot worse than it's going to hurt them. And we, my great-grandfather marched with Gandhi, and it was about salt. Right? And they're saying, we're going to boycott this product and make it ourselves. And I took to heart this idea that economic control was really, really important. And it took me a long time to reckon with what happens we were in a culture of abundance broadly, especially in the digital world, and that puts us in a post-boycott space when it comes to reckoning with the major tech players. You cannot meaningfully get off of YouTube and Facebook and Google and have them even feel the pinch. And the biggest opportunity we have is, and I think that's just true, And I actually think that's not going to change because of the nature of the way networks generate value for each other. And yet the fact that they still direct us to that, when Eric Schmidt says, well, then just don't use Google, he's not just being ridiculous, he's being strategic, right? Which is to say, he wants you to focus on the impossibility of that so that you're like, oh, I guess we're just beholden to you and your benevolence. And what we're able to do is shift this into where can they feel pain? And the only place, the only cost we have right now around the major tech companies is hiring talent. This is where they invest the most. So they'll pay $1 million over a couple years and paying lawyers to bring an H-1B worker here to the US to work. They will pay these hiring bonuses to the kids coming out of Stanford. And they even do, what they call the acqui-hire, which is a company gets funded, usually from investors that share investing in the major companies. They run for a couple years, the product fails, and then they sell the company, the team, to one of the big companies. And what that's doing is the investors are essentially just transferring money from their left pocket to their right pocket. But they took the funnel of these kids who now feel like entrepreneurs and they brought them into these major tech companies. And, sorry, your lottery ticket didn't win. What happens through that structure is a couple things are reified. One, the kids get to feel like they had a shot, and that's good for them, I guess. And the ability to have a fixed pipeline of bringing that talent in and a structure for bringing them on board is cemented in the big companies. They have these unfair advantages in acquiring talent, just as they do in the unfair advantages in the rest of the social network. That's the part we have to attack, is their ability to get talent. And the biggest way we can do that is, overwhelmingly, these young people do have a really strong sense of ethics. They do have a really strong social conscience. And for example, right now, Uber is not getting top grade talent, period. Right? And they can offer as much as they want. People are like, I am not getting that stink on me. Right? So that's the reason I say there's this milestone we've crossed, is where we first said, no matter how much money they put out there and how much upside there is, and the fact that people are making a profit off of Uber, the best coders, designers, developers, whatever these technical roles are that are still valued very highly, are saying, I'm not willing to go. And how do you attach that accountability around the only costs that we can affect through society's norms to all of these companies around their ethical and moral decisions? That's the work, and it's hard, and it takes a long time, and it does take us being educated as citizens and consumers, because we can't even put that pressure on telling your kid, you know what, you're going to get the same amount of salary, why don't you go to this other company instead of there?
My question is, at what point does software technology become immoral? In a sense of, now we download an app, but then in 10 years, we're going to start creating, robotics that can do the work of 20% of Americans who are unskilled. So at what point do we decide that it's immoral to roll out this new technology, or will we ever do that, and will we just adapt or fall behind?
Various forms of technology over the course of history have often displaced people from work, often in great numbers. One of the statistics that I like to use in a situation like this is that in the year 1900, 50% of Americans who were employed worked on a farm. And in the year 1950, there was no lower employment rate, but 2% of Americans in 1950 worked on a farm. So various forms of technological innovation in agriculture had a massive displacement of people engaged in labor in agriculture. And so the open question is whether or not these newer forms of technology, artificial intelligence and robotics, will displace people in a way that's unlike previous historical transitions, or we're just waiting to see what the new kinds of work there will be that will evolve. And I'm sure, well, maybe I'm not sure. In Silicon Valley, you can't go a week without stumbling across a conference or a workshop on a universal basic income. And the idea there, which seems characteristic to me of the tech community, a fundamentally defensive posture that the tech community seems to have rallied around the idea of providing people a universal basic income, not because it's good for their freedom or not because it's equality enhancing, but because it fundamentally protects them reputationally from having been responsible for making people unemployed. That's the current language or discourse in Silicon Valley. And I would, perhaps side with the technologists here in saying that the technology itself is neither immoral or moral. It's a force in the world, and we have to confront it morally. And universal basic income is just one such mechanism to confront the threat of technological unemployment.
Yeah, I would sharpen a couple
Deploy
of the
it
points.
morally, too.
Yeah,
Deploy it.
yeah.
That's sure.
A couple of things I would add there is there will be a displacement on scale with the displacement of agriculture being automated. That's coming, right? The questions about whether it's moral or not depend on how we do it, not the what, right? And the how is a couple parts. The one is UBI, Universal Basic Income, as Silicon Valley is advancing it, is structured to just take all the externalities of this and foist it on the rest of society. They are not proposing that they would raise the taxes on Google and Facebook and these other companies enough to cover the new UBI, right? They're just saying, well, let's just make everybody else pay for it. So, and we're in the same way that we already subsidize essentially the way Walmart hires workers by providing a social safety net that augments the wages that Walmart provides to its workers. That's where we can get into evaluating morality, right? Is if you displace people and you force the burden of that disruption you put on their lives onto others, and you extract enormous profit from doing so without having a dialogue with society about your role in it. That, to me, is where you get into the realm of what's moral, what's ethical here. But I think the other challenges are we see the big trends, and so you could talk about, okay, self-driving tractor trailers are coming, and millions of drivers are going to be out of work, and that's a real important reckoning. But the reason that's possible is that truck drivers have been intensely surveilled for years, and so we have all the data to make the self-driving software around there. So the moral choice was made 10 years ago, right? Like the path that we're on was sort of already decided, and the question's about how we respond to it. And when we start to see the social pressure force them to say, I support UBI and I support paying for it because we're the richest companies in the history of the world, then we can evaluate the morality of it. The what is not the question, the how is what the question.
Woman in the purple jacket in the back.
You spoke earlier about how there is not yet a codification of ethical guidelines and standards for the tech industry as a whole, and if there were to be, some government agency maybe regulating it. My question to you is, if there is to be one compiled and codified, what do you think should be some of the basic principles on there, and who are the stakeholders to whom it would apply? Because you have individuals, you have corporations, you have society as a whole. And it's such a huge, big thing that it almost seems to me, since the world is changing, exponentially towards being tech-driven this way, that maybe we're in a position now where we write a new Constitution, Declaration of Independence, or that there needs to be something on a whole kind of bigger scale to sort of address those issues, because it's not simple. And who would write it? You said who might regulate it, but who would come up with it?
And it's not just the US either, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
There are a lot of questions in there. Let me pick a couple that I know how to answer and ignore the rest. I think.
Good strategy with
Yeah,
4
exactly.
minutes
This is very effective. The couple things I would say is there won't be one standard. There'll be a lot, and for them to work, they have to be specific to domain. Right? What you do with a photo sharing app versus what you do with self-driving car software is going to be very different, and so that makes sense. And the goal is to have as many stakeholders as possible at the table in shaping these things. The nice thing is technology is very oriented, the industry is very oriented, and the community is very oriented towards collaboratively editing policy and documents together. They do it in wikis like Wikipedia. They do it in open source software where they're editing the code together. So there is a lot of tradition around collaborating around relatively complex documents. The question is about alignment around goals, and that's where it really speaks to like which stakeholders can you get to the table. I don't necessarily think there's going to be like a one true rule. I mean, I think like IEEE has a set of ethics, but I think the telling thing is that's been around for decades, and I've never heard of a single company that fired somebody because they transgressed across it, right? So we're not even, you can do basic, golden rule type ethical rules, like don't deliberately be awful to people, and even that would be really hard to enforce right now. And so I think the goal is we could start by iterating on very, very simple and small, obvious rules that almost everybody would universally agree on, and see if we can build enforcement around that, and then sort of that'd be a self-perpetuating loop. But you're the expert on this.
Thanks. I also think about professional codes of ethics as one tool among many, and the thing that I would be, I guess, somewhat frightened of is if we arrived at a moment when whatever mechanism that generated a professional code of ethics was then something that every coder or engineer had a little note card to stick in her back pocket and say, all right, if I've checked off the privacy box and I've checked off the surveillance, whatever it turns out to be, I'm good to go. And you can stop thinking morally afterwards.
Yeah.
I think from my point of view, the task is, since things are changing socially and technologically all the time, it's to develop a kind of, if you, for lack of a better phrase, a moral compass, or the capacity to engage morally in an ongoing way. With a code of ethics, that's fine, but it should be an evolving document itself. I think of, you mentioned it earlier in your question, that hospitals in particular have ethics committees. And so if there's a thorny question of medical practice, you can refer it to an ethics committee. And an ethics committee, typically composed of people from various different stakeholder groups, not just the doctors, not just the patients, people in the community, people on the investing side, hash out how to think about this particularly difficult question with a few values to help orient them: beneficence and autonomy and privacy, but not an algorithm where you spit out the correct moral answer at the end of the day. From my point of view, the task is to be morally awake everywhere and always, knowing that there's no single morally correct answer. Sure, we can say things like, don't do things that are horrifically evil. That's a really low standard, though.
Yeah.
So I'm for moral awakeness and moral dialogue, where formal mechanisms like professional codes of ethics and ethics committees are mechanisms for sustaining remaining awake.
Well, we have pretty much run out of time, I think, so I'm not going to be able to take any other comments. But I mean, this is giving me more hope than I expected to come out with. But the hope is really predicated on everyone taking responsibility, and not just people within companies at all levels, but as consumers, as investors.
Right.
We all have the power in small ways to shape where this goes. You know, as voters as well, let's not forget.
Absolutely.
And let's exercise it to the maximum extent that we can.